What's particularly interesting about the early years of hip-hop culture, both the music, the dance, the art, everything, is that it emerged out of what can only be described as a postmodern wasteland. Out of hopelessness, out of wreckage, came an entire new art form that has dominated the pop art landscape for the last 40 years. But to start with, and to understand it, let's first back up just a little bit and review very briefly some of the elements of modernism and postmodernism. Now, again, postmodernism was this plunge from the darkness of modernism into the idea that freedom is an illusion, and people felt betrayed. They didn't trust institutions. Postmodernism, as I say here, argued that there is no truth. The only thing that you can trust is perception, because that's all there is. And then so we find ourselves in a position where we trust perceptions we have faith in over empirical truths. From this, we get the postmodern narratives. They are, again, typically nonlinear. They jump around through time. They jump around through place. Sometimes there's hopelessness and so forth. But the key here, the important part that's relevant, is not just the outlook, but in particular the nonlinear story. A traditional story is going to go A to B to C to D. Remember, with postmodernism, remember the concept of deconstructionism, where we ask ourselves not how must a story go, but what is the experience we want from a story. And what we want is surprise and excitement and engagement and intensity. And sometimes the way to do that is to jump around, both for the surprise, but in particular, as I say here, when you don't go in a linear direction, you don't have to keep everything. Now, this is a direct result, actually, from the advent of cinema, which we'll try to get into later with the history of cinema. But you can drop all the boring stuff. You can just keep the interesting parts by moving in a nonlinear direction. Now, that's going to be really important when we get into the music of early hip-hop. All right, changing tracks a little bit and looking at the era from which this emerges. In particular, the Bronx in the 1970s. The Bronx in the 1970s was renowned for its desolate state. Horrible poverty, massive urban decay, unemployment in the 30s and 40s and 50% at times. These are still shots from that time period. The one in the center here, that's a school. That school is in session. Look at the windows, right? You got fires everywhere. There were no resources to fight the fires. The buildings were so old and unkept that the fires moved very quickly, and people in desperate straits would sometimes burn their own offices in an attempt to get the insurance. Absolute hopelessness. Remember, the 70s, this is after the civil rights era had ended for all intents and purposes, and virtually every leader in it had been killed. We were seeing also then gentrification and urbanization, where people were building highways and bypasses that forced people into neighborhoods together who had never lived together. But this hybridization, this combining of cultures, is part of what's going to spark this new movement. So what are the elements of hip-hop culture that are going to be relevant here? There's basically three core elements. DJing and MCing, which focuses on, of course, playing music, but in particular, recontextualizing music based on audience interaction. What it's going to do is it's going to zero in on the key elements and say, what if you just did the best parts? What if you just created something new out of pieces from 25 different pieces of music? Second, breakdancing, which actually came out of gang violence. There was, if you've ever heard of old-timey battles, they would start with what was called parley, or from the French to speak, parler, where before the battle, the idea was it was one last chance to avoid violence, and the leaders would ride out and, in theory, say, surely we can avoid this bloodshed. But what they would actually do is they would say it as threats, right? Your last chance, because my boys back there are gonna this and that, and blah, 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 blah. Well, the gangs would do the same thing. And during this time period, these displays got more and more and more theatrical. They would play music. They would do whole things to sort of show what horrors they were going to inflict on each other. And it gradually became an interpretive thing, where people, essentially like the Olympics, right? The Olympics took traditional battlefield skills, spears, throwing rocks, outrunning the others, chariot racing, and so forth, and said, what if we just competed with those? And instead of actually killing each other, we just see who's best at it. Same deal here. Talk more about that later. Graffiti then, which can be disputed whether that is an aspect of hip-hop culture, but it certainly, street art emerges out of this time period, starts with tagging, but then quickly grows into, amidst this decay, adding art to the side of a burned-out building actually improved the building, or the side of rotting subways and so forth. So these are the basic core elements that are going to come out of it. The actual beginning is often credited to this man. He called himself DJ Kool Herc. And really what he did, now hip-hop started very, very simply. It started in party culture. It did not start as some sort of civil movement or a cause. That's going to come later. What Kool Herc did, he didn't play the whole song. What he would do is he would find the best part. He'd deconstruct the song, the break beat, some hook, some part of it that was the best part. And he could then create a song based on just that piece for as long or as little as the audience was into it, right? Now, the problem, of course, as you can see here, is it wasn't the 2 turntables, it was 1. So you'd have to, play it, pause, right? And so it was hardly perfected. Then people would start talking along. Now, initially, this was not rap as we know it. It was really just people coming up and talking into the mic. They'd be talking to the crowd, trying to get people fired up. It would also be where we would start getting the tradition in hip-hop of bragging comes out of this culture of, maybe you're trying to talk up your friends, right? And you're saying, hey man, your convertible's double parked outside. You don't have a car at all. But people would go up and they would sort of do their thing while Kool Herc spun. And logically, if you get up and you're like, hey, is everybody having fun? That's good. And then the next person gets up there and tells you to put your hands in the air and wave them around like you just don't care, they're going to get a lot bigger reaction. And that's what starts growing and growing into what we think of as rapping and hip-hop culture. Now, the 2 big people who come after that. The first one is a man named Afrika Bambaataa. And he's really important to this era, not so much for the music he created, but for the inspiration he created. Now, he was a gang leader who organized the rival gangs in the Bronx into one massive group called Zulu Nation and got them focused on creating instead of attacking. Again, it's hard to overstate in the midst of no chance for employment, no sense of future, ongoing violence. This group of people, and in particular Bambaataa, focused on what can we do then? What can we create? Now, the next big person to come along is somebody named Grandmaster Flash, and he's going to become sort of the first superstar of the era. He's the one who came up with the 2 turntables, and he's the one who also really started breaking out of others as well, Grandmaster Caz, a lot of other people who started saying it doesn't have to just be James Brown. We can get into, flamenco music. We can get into anything. And he's the one who said, what if you had 2 turntables at the same time? So while one's spinning, you're setting up the other one, and this is going to start leading to, and then, if you're going to let the other one play for a bit, you can do all kinds of crazy things. I mean, obviously, I'm simplifying. There's a lot more, but 3 of the key people, Kool Herc, Afrika Bambaataa, Grandmaster Flash. Now, the next part we're going to get into are sort of the key moments that led hip-hop to explode. Because at this point, it's really just very, very small party culture in the Bronx, unknown to more than, say, a few hundred people. But these tiny little proto-developments, I guess you could say, are setting the stage for a massive change in the music in New York, the United States, and eventually the world.